Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone who's watching to what I know is going to be an illuminating conversation between two outstanding historians, Antony Beevor and Margaret MacMillan, which is taking place as part of the Charleston Literary Festival programme of events celebrated in South Carolina every November. Antony Beevor is an acclaimed best-selling author who's won innumerable prestigious prizes for his meticulously researched work, specialising in military history and the two 20th century world wars. He's famous for weaving gripping personal stories into his research, and this is particularly evident in his current book, which he's discussing today, Russia, Revolution and the Civil War, 1917 to 1921. Margaret MacMillan, whose research specialises in British imperial history and the international history of the 19th and 20th centuries, is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Toronto and Emeritus Professor of International History at Oxford University, UK. Her latest book is War, How Conflict Shaped Us. There couldn't be two more knowledgeable and insightful historians, allowing us to eavesdrop on their conversation about the Russian Revolution, its aftermath, and reverberations in Ukraine today. I'm going to hand over to Antony Beevor, who will set the scene.
The Russian Civil War was certainly not a local affair. Not only did this conflict extend across the whole of the Eurasian landmass, from Central Europe to the Far East, more than a sixth of the Earth's surface, as Soviet propaganda later emphasized. It involved countless nations in a form of proxy world war. Far from being merely an internal conflict between Reds and Whites, it had immense geopolitical ramifications, with many countries and foreign troops, British, French, American, Czechoslovak, Japanese, Italian, Serbian, Greek and Romanian. It affected all the former parts of the Russian Empire, including Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Central Asia and Siberia. And the Bolsheviks' Red Army included many units of so-called internationalist volunteers, most of whom were former prisoners of war from the German, the Austro-Hungarian and even Bulgarian armies, as well as regiments raised from Chinese labourers, many of whom spread the Bolshevik creed on their return home. The death toll of as many as 10 million, some even say 12 million, during the course of this particular conflict had major international consequences. Red victory led directly to the era of savage totalitarianism, what Osip Mandelstam famously called the Wolfhound Century. Accounts of the horrors and destruction across the former Russian Empire triggered in many countries either a frantic terror of Bolshevism or of a white fascist determination to crush all forms of socialism and even liberalism. This impersonal cruelty of political ideology and the frenzied violence of the enraged mob created a vicious circle of fear and loathing, which led eventually to the Spanish Civil War and then the Second World War. So although many historians recognize the First World War as the original catastrophe of the 20th century, it was its aftermath, the extended Russian Civil War, which became the most influential conflict of the age. And it still has its echoes today, as we are seeing in Ukraine. Fratricidal wars are bound to be cruel because of their lack of definable front lines, because of their instant extension into civilian life, and because of the terrible hatreds and suspicions which they engender. Yet the brutality of the Russian onslaught, which we have seen in Ukraine, has raised a debate about its origins. For example, in the London Times, David Aronovich recently speculated about what he called the casual savagery of Russian troops. Of course, one can never generalize about a whole nation, especially not Russia, with all of its component nationalities and its historic split between Slavophiles and Westerners, going back to Putin's idol Peter the Great. Above all, there can of course be no such thing as a DNA-based national character. Yet at the same time, most countries are often influenced, at least subconsciously, by a certain self-image or national narrative. Perhaps ever since the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, the Russian attitude has been conditioned to the idea that conspicuous violence and cruelty is a natural weapon of war. Fire and sword, terror, rape and looting were essential components in the Civil War, and they also emerged in the Second World War as revenge for the barbarous Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. And we see them now again in Ukraine. Yet, the most grotesque aspect of Putin's war against Ukraine is his self-hypnotized conviction that it is somehow a replay of the victory over Nazism. So, Margaret, let's hear what questions you have to say and what your views are on the whole situation.
Well, Antony, I've got lots of questions because your book raises a lot of questions, and what you've just said has raised them yet again. And I just want to say, can I show a picture of it for people who haven't seen it? This is the most wonderful book, enormously depressing, but absolutely gripping. I mean, you've done it, as Diana said, you have this capacity for weaving in individual stories in a way that makes you want to read more. You become fascinated by what's going on, but you also, as you just did in your remarks, gave the bigger picture. And I think we will have a lot to talk about. Could I start by asking you, and many congratulations on this book, could I start by asking you something you said about the Russian Civil War, that it was a collection of wars. So what were the different wars? It was not only something with huge international ramifications that, as you say, affected a very large part of the world, but you've also said it was a collection of wars. What were some of those different wars that were going on inside the Russian Civil War?
Well, there were a number of internal wars, particularly in Central Asia already. Even as early as 1916, there had been sort of uprisings there. There were always other tensions, but what one finds also in every single civil war, or I think in most, and it was certainly true of the Spanish Civil War, is that you basically find three axes of conflict. One of them, of course, is going to be left versus right. Another one will be centralism against regionalism. And the third will be authoritarianism against libertarianism. And I've always found it very striking the way that you should have had Spain and Russia, both extremes, if you like, of the geographical extremes of the European landmass, with the largest anarchist or libertarian movements. And I think that's most striking, and we see this very much in Russia during the Russian Civil War, as well as we find later on in the 1930s in the case of Spain.
I've always wondered, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, whether if Russia had not gone into the First World War, or if the First World War had not happened, the collapse of the regime would not have taken place. These are all speculations. And could the regime have reformed itself? I mean, you write at the beginning of your book about the nature of that regime, but it was presiding over a country which was changing. The regime itself had been forced to give away some constitutional government after the Russo-Japanese War. Do you think the First World War was the death blow to the regime, and did it open the door to what then happened?
I think it was the death blow for the simple reason that the experience of the troops on the Eastern Front was so appalling. They were so badly looked after and supplied. Many of them didn't have boots. It was bound to create a bitter anger. And the idea that somehow the regime itself would have reformed itself naturally is impossible to answer. I've always been very nervous about counterfactual history, preferring to leave that to one or two other historians we could perhaps both name. But I, on the whole, I would have thought that one can say fairly safely that it was much less likely for the Russian Revolution to have taken place. there were elements beforehand which we saw, whether it was the Black Hundreds, which had a lot of the anti-Semitism, which even the Czar himself had encouraged. In a way, one could describe that almost as a form of sort of proto-fascism. So some of these axes of conflict or whatever were already developing at that particular time, but that did not necessarily mean that there was going to be a revolution or a civil war. When the revolution came in February 1917, nobody really expected it. Funnily enough, that's a slight contradiction, because everybody was expecting a revolution either before the end of the war or after it. But if there'd been no war at that particular stage, there wasn't really a reason for the food riots or the resentment which built up. And especially, for example, it was the women demonstrators, in a way, who kicked off the Russian Revolution. So the Bolsheviks had nothing to do with it. None of them were there. Nobody expected it.
And I suppose the war also made possible the presence of all the soldiers who left the front with their weapons. Once you get sort of people wandering around cities in armed bands, the regime has already lost control.
It has, and the disintegration of the Tsarist army at that particular stage was, from Lenin's point of view, the biggest advantage in creating what he felt should be the irreversible nature of the revolution. That once you've had sufficient destruction, killing, and the taking over both of land and of industry by the people working it, they won't want to go back. So all of this sort of really depended upon the disintegration of the army. That's absolutely right.
Lenin, who you mentioned, talked about the irreversible forces, and of course we have to take into account the social and economic and political forces that made the Russian Revolution possible and then made the Civil War possible. But since you've mentioned Lenin, I want to ask how important you think the individuals are here. Would it have happened in the same way without Lenin?
I don't think so. I mean, Lenin was astonishing in his perspective, above all of his view. One has to remember that actually one of the great advantages was that nobody took him seriously to begin with. Even within the Bolshevik Party, even the Bolshevik Central Committee, his ideas appeared to be so extreme. And as a result, the other socialist parties, whether Mensheviks, socialist revolutionaries and so forth, did not really see him as a threat. And it was only when the chaos, really, of the early summer and then of the July days, where it became clear that actually the Bolsheviks were preparing to seize power, as Lenin had predicted. And this is where shall we say, the establishment at that particular stage, which was the provisional government led by Kerensky, again, in a mood of almost fantasy, believed that there was no threat from that particular direction, and by then it was going to be too late.
The Bolsheviks, when they seized power, were tiny, weren't they? I mean, they'd never won an election. They never got a majority. It was a coup d'etat. If they had been opposed, I mean, again, just wondering, and I'm not going to do too many counterfactuals, but if the White Russians, those who were opposed to the Bolsheviks after 1917, if they had managed to get a single coherent leadership, would they have had a chance? I mean, were they strong enough to beat the Bolsheviks?
The Whites, unfortunately for themselves, were in a way rather like, actually, funny enough, the Reds in the Spanish Civil War. There were so many competing factions within them that it was impossible to have a single chain of command, and therefore command and control. And this was the great advantage which the Reds had. But going back slightly to Lenin, I mean, what one has to recognise in the case of Lenin is, to what degree you reject the great man theory of history, which Tolstoy did so much to try to undermine, and accept the fact that without Lenin, it's very, very hard to have imagined the single-mindedness which he provided, and above all when it comes later on to major strategic decisions, especially the whole question of Brest-Litovsk, which was a big treaty in March of 1918 with the Germans, which the Germans were able to impose because of their strength and because of the collapse of the Tsarist armies. And Lenin realized that they had to suffer this humiliation of losing the Baltic provinces, Belarus, and the whole of Ukraine to the Germans if they were going to survive into the civil war which was bound to follow. And I think Lenin predicted or foresaw that with the entry of the Americans into the war, that the central powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary would be defeated on the Western Front. And then that would be the moment, really, for the Bolsheviks to fill the vacuum which had been created by this occupation of Western areas before the whites. Because at that stage, we have to remember that the whites had no support, international support, simply because of the Ottoman Empire. There was no way that the British could get through ammunition or other supplies to the whites in southern Russia, which was their one area of strength at that particular stage.
Mentioning individuals again, I mean, I've always thought that without Trotsky mobilizing the Red Armies, the Bolsheviks might not have been able to hang on, that he played a very important role in actually creating a military force for the Bolsheviks. Would you agree or not?
Well, yes, I mean, but Trotsky certainly, by his extraordinary ability of his oratorical powers, his ability to organize, and above all, his energy. I mean, he seemed to be absolutely inexhaustible, played a very important role. On the other hand, Trotsky also played a disastrous role when it came to the Czechs. And they played, as I say, an important role because the Czechs have been split up really between the three armies, between Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Russia. But most of them decided that they wanted very much to be with Russia, and this is why they deserted during the course of the First World War. They deserted from the German and Austro-Hungarian armies, and so a Czech legion was formed on the Russian side of the lines. And it was a question of what to do with them. The French wanted them to come all the way back by the Trans-Siberian Railway and then to be shipped from Vladivostok. And that would have been fine. But then they had clashes with local Soviets along the Trans-Siberian Railway. And Trotsky lost his temper and said that any Czech found with a weapon in hand would be executed on the spot. And this actually created the whole of the war in Siberia, because without the Czechs, Admiral Kolchak and the White Forces would never really have stood a chance. So, shall we say, Trotsky played a very mixed role in that particular way, both a brilliant organizer of the Red Army, but a disastrous strategic mistake in 1918.
That order of Trotsky's to shoot any Czech found with a weapon seems to me to indicate that right from the beginning, the Bolsheviks had a ruthlessness that made them very formidable enemies indeed. I mean, it's not that the whites couldn't be ruthless, as you show in your book, but the Bolsheviks knew they could use terror and were prepared to use it right from the beginning. And I wonder, looking ahead to the present, how much that willingness to use terror against often those who are innocent or often those who are your own people has marked the government of Russia ever since 1917.
Well, I think we've seen more than enough evidence of that. You're quite right, of evidence of that in Ukraine, and we certainly saw it in the Second World War. So I don't think there's anything that's sort of particularly new in that way. And I do think it goes back a little bit to what I was saying in sort of that intro of this idea of how far back this notion of the use of terror, of destruction and all the rest of it, has actually influenced Russian attitudes. Europe went through its period of enlightenment, humanism or humanity, and especially also in the 19th century, where things started to become rather less ferocious and less savage in warfare. But not very much has changed in Russia. And I mean, even to this day, one sees that the sort of Russian military doctrine has evolved very, very little when it comes to dealing with civilian targets and cities. The idea is you just simply smash it with artillery. There's been very little evolution at all in that particular way. And I think this is always one of the most sort of striking things with Russia and the way that it is, in many ways, always been a prisoner of its own past.
That's very interesting, and I wonder if you could also say that shows in the way the Russians use their troops, that they seem prepared to sacrifice troops in ways that Western powers moved away from. I mean, certainly Western powers have done that in the past, and they did in the First World War. But in the case of Russia, I mean, looking at what's been happening in Ukraine, the Russian soldiers who've been sent without proper equipment, that again seems to be something that has not changed over the century. Absolutely.
I mean, what we see, in fact, is, in a way, I think this is the mentality of serfdom. That the bulk of the soldiers were serfs who had sent from their villages. They had very little option. In fact, they had no option at all about going. Most of them, their families literally said goodbye to them as if they were going to their death, assuming that they probably were going to their death in many cases. So from that point of view, yes, there's always been this attitude of maltreatment of their own people, often almost as bad as their treatment of their enemies. And we see this today, as you rightly say, the way that they have to buy their own body armour, the way that even they've been told that they should borrow the tampons of their wives or girlfriends or mothers even or whatever, because they weren't going to get any bandages. I mean, this is unbelievable in a supposedly modern army that soldiers can be treated in this way. But also, I think that in itself is a contribution towards the anger, the resentment, and the behaviour, the violent behaviour of Russian troops, because it's what I would sort of describe as the knock-on theory of oppression. I mean, because they have been so badly treated by their own officers and commanders, that they will then take it out on whoever they can. And we saw this in 1945 in the advance into Germany, and we've seen it again in Ukraine.
And it certainly comes out in your book on your book on the advance into the end of the war in Germany is absolutely horrific when you talk about what the Russian troops did. But in this new book on the Civil War, what strikes me so often is you have these forces who come into a town or village, don't actually care what the people there think or believe in, and simply see them as to be exploited. There seems to be no sense that you want to try and win these people over, that they have any views of themselves.
That is absolutely true, but that actually is also reflecting the whole attitude right from the top. The idea, basically, that Russia has the right to impose its own version of ethno-Slav nationalism and orthodoxy and so forth on not just Russian territory or former Russian Empire territory, but even on sort of the whole of Europe, because they feel that sort of they have a superior calling in a way. And the only parallel one can make to that, of course, is the Nazi view of the 1930s that they had a right to rule over any country that they invaded.
Do you think also, I mean, what perhaps, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what you saw with the Bolshevik Revolution was you saw, as Karl Marx once said, that men make revolutions but not under circumstances of their own choosing. And that you make a revolution and you often take on many of the features of the regime that you've displaced. And so, I don't want to sort of but I just wonder how you would react to the idea that what the Bolsheviks did was do something that was very Russian. They drew on the traditions and the past, but they also had an ideology which they believed was going to transform the world. And I always thought that ideologies can be very dangerous, because if you see a utopia in the future, it doesn't matter how many people die getting there, because in the end, we're all going to be better off. Is it that combination of the Russian past plus this ideology of building this new world that makes what happened so awful?
Yes. I mean, if you can morally justify mass terror, it's the horrors are potentially unlimited, and we've seen this. We saw it perhaps even an even worse version in China under Mao. On how many millions of people could die, and yet one can still somehow attempt, a regime can still somehow attempt to justify that. In the case, of course, of Marx and the sort of the general attitude, yes, he's right. I mean, revolutions never quite turn out as you predict. To a certain degree, I think that was always because they were looking over their shoulder at the French Revolution. And so everybody was wondering who was going to be the Bonaparte, who was going to be the Napoleon of the Russian Revolution. I mean, Kerensky, in a ludicrous way, thought that he might be the Bonaparte of the Russian Revolution, and others made other predictions. But of course, it never turned out that way. It actually turned out to be far, far worse because of the determination to crush any opposition to the system, to the Bolshevik system, but also any idea of incompetence or any idea of corruption or anything like that was always going to be seen as a sort of deliberate treason or as a deliberate sabotage. And so as a result, it engendered a form of terrifying suspicions, which was why Lenin, right from the start, even December 1917, invents the Cheka, the secret police, who are responsible for the most appalling tortures and executions during that whole period of the Civil War and afterwards.
I once read that one of the Bolshevik advantages was, and then you talk about this as well, that they occupied the center and their enemies were around the periphery. And so you have, how many different white forces do you have, and how much do they actually have in common?
Well, you're quite right. This was the real difficulty for the whites. I mean, the advantage of internal the central element really meant that they were able to reinforce the different fronts whenever they needed to. And this became absolutely crucial in the early part of 1918, when the whites in the south didn't realize to what degree Kolchak's forces were collapsing in Siberia, and the way that the Reds were going to be able to bring their troops in. And communications were so bad. I mean, it took sometimes 3 weeks, to get a reply. So there was hardly any communication. Radios simply weren't strong enough in those days. So you had the sort of British commanded force right up in the north in Murmansk and Archangel. They had some white troops with them, but most of them spent most of their time mutinying against their sort of British officers. Or you had a force in Estonia under General Yudenich, who was appallingly incompetent, and they managed to provoke both the Finns, who were potential allies, and the Estonians, simply because of their Russian imperial arrogance, and basically assuming that they would be that the Estonians themselves would be absorbed back into the Russian Empire. And of course, and the Poles too. So, I mean, they already had managed to provoke basically all of their potential allies in that way. But then in the south, you had one of the largest groups, of course, under General Denikin, which were the armed forces of southern Russia. And they were the ones who probably were the closest in getting to Moscow in their great advance of 1919. But once again, we see, partly because of the size of the whole country, the inability to resupply your advancing troops, the way that quite often you'd have a very rapid advance and then perhaps an even more rapid retreat afterwards. But then you have the large force in Siberia and in the Urals of Admiral Kolchak. But they again were ruined by corruption, by incompetence, but also by their, appalling political views that although some of them were right socialist revolutionaries, basically moderate socialists, they had no way of controlling their commanders, their military commanders, who were all reactionary Tsarist officers. So there was very little chance of a unity, which is essential, if you like, in that sort of conflict.
You mentioned what Kolchak and the reactionary officers stood for. I mean, it's always struck me that one of the great slogans of all time was Lenin's slogan of peace, bread, and land, that made such sense to ordinary Russians who'd been suffering so much. So the whites were either not capable or not able to offer anything similar, were they?
They had no program of reform whatsoever. Because most of them, and especially the officers, and especially if they seem to be the younger officers, who were the ones who felt the most bitter about family estates being destroyed or burned down or whatever during that chaotic spring and summer of 1917. And they wanted more, in many cases, they just simply wanted revenge. So they were offering nothing to the peasants, even though the peasants had often been outraged by the way that the Reds sent round their food detachments and basically stole all their food, including often their seed corn. So that was hardly surprising that they created a vicious circle leading towards famine later on. Therefore, the whole notion of trying to support the whites, which they did quite often to begin with, thinking, well, they must be better than the Reds, but then they found actually the whites were just as bad, if not worse, because they too would seize the food, and they did nothing to, in any way, offer any form of civil administration, which could help. But yes, the slogan about sort of, land and liberty, bread and liberty, and so forth, was part of Lenin's three great promises, which were basically, that the factories would be taken over by the workers. Well, that was never going to be the case because Lenin was determined that it would be the state and the party which, of course, would run all the factories. Ditto with the land, because, of course, they were intending to bring in collective farms and not to allow the peasants to run their own land. And, of course, the promise of peace when the soldiers wanted to end the war, but Lenin actually wanted to change the war from the imperialist war against Germany into this international civil war. So those three lies of the founding lies, one might almost say, of the Soviet Union were absolutely essential in basically winning the civil war.
The Bolsheviks later on, there's so many ways which you can think of opportunities taken or missed. The Bolsheviks later on claimed that they had not only defeated the whites, they'd also defeated outside imperialists who'd intervened. How effective was the intervention, and what were the different, because there were a number of different interventions, weren't there, with different motives in different parts of Russia?
Well, the intervention came about in a, shall we say, completely unplanned way. One has to remember November 1918, sudden end of the First World War on the Western Front, and the idea that the Supreme Allied Command in Paris was suddenly having to reorder the world. So they had so many things, as you would know far better than me, in terms of what they were getting onto at Versailles and everything that had to be sorted out there. That the two great anti-Bolsheviks at the time, of course, were Clemenceau and Winston Churchill, who'd just been appointed Secretary of State for War by Lloyd George. Clemenceau was determined to send troops on the ground and also the French Navy to the Black Sea, purely to make sure that sort of Bolshevism didn't really take root in Russia. The British were offering basically supplies, not fighting troops. I mean, even Churchill had to acknowledge that it would cause mutinies, and already there was severe unrest amongst British armed forces at the end of the First World War, with everybody wanting to come home, and then suddenly being told, well, actually, no, it looks as if we're about to fight another war. Not surprisingly, that would have created almost a revolution back in Britain. So as a result, it was really a question of supplying the whites with as much material of war, of the guns, the ammunition left over from the fighting, uniforms and so forth. And all of these were then being shipped into the Black Sea and landed there and distributed really to Denikin's armies. Churchill was hoping that the Americans would then supply Kolchak's armies across the Trans-Siberian Railway. But the Americans were much more cautious. I think Woodrow Wilson realized that this was not a conflict which they would be keen on getting involved in. But at the same time, the Americans were rightly nervous about the Japanese ambitions in the Far East, and the Japanese landing close to 80,000 troops altogether through Vladivostok, and with quite shameless determination to try to take over areas on the Far Eastern coast. Then the Americans were keeping a very much closer eye on events there.
This became really a very important sort of myth almost, or narrative in the Soviet Union, didn't it? That the outside powers tried to strangle the revolution in its cradle. We always have to be suspicious of them. I mean, do you see a direct line again through the Soviet Union into the present Russia?
Oh, I mean, I think it goes back far further than that. I mean, it goes back and comes forward in the sense that it goes even back to this idea of Russia surrounded, Rus contra mundum, and that somehow there is a sort of an international conspiracy to crush, out of jealousy, wanting to crush, Russian orthodoxy and everything it stood for. So that one, I'm afraid, is almost an eternal element of the Russian psyche, if one can risk such a generalization.
Can we just go back to the Civil War briefly? And I know we could talk about it all afternoon, but how much of it is there was ideology involved, there were beliefs involved, but how much of it was also just opportunism and greed? I mean, I'm thinking of the people who emerged on top, and you talk a lot about, for example, I'm not going to pronounce his name correctly, Shkuro. Shkuro. I mean, he seems to be someone who simply, the sort of person who exists in almost every society, but you keep them under control. And war gave him his chance.
Well, I mean, I'm afraid, especially in a civil war, you will get psychopaths coming to the top, who will seize any opportunity to make money. Many of the white generals, I think deep down knew that they probably were not going to win the Civil War. So they were taking every opportunity they could to make money on the side, to subsidize their exile. Some of them were gambling it away in Constantinople, or living with extraordinary luxury and so forth. But I mean, the corruption was appalling. And many of them would sell off the uniforms that the British were landing, simply because clothes were almost impossible. There was hardly any material. And even hospital beds which were being sent, which was supposed to be for the wounded, all of those were being sold off. And the looting, again, was sort of almost beyond belief. So from that point of view, we saw a fundamental level of corruption amongst the whites. Of course, there was corruption with the Reds too. I mean, if they could get hold of gold or whatever it might be, nobody knew what the future held. So, people were saving up in a way for this sort of totally indefinable, but rather frightening future, which they saw coming.
From your book, I very much got the impression of people saying all the normal conventions have gone. We can do exactly what we want. And what struck me was also the treatment of women, the ways in which women were treated as prizes.
absolutely. But I mean, that, I'm afraid, was something that one saw even before, even in the 19th century, but particularly in Central Asia. I mean, I describe, and Shklovsky and others, describe about these slave markets, which I had no idea about in large parts of Central Asia. And when in a famine, people would actually sell their daughters. No, I agree. I mean, it's something which we find so shocking today that it's almost hard to imagine any family doing anything of the sort.
What about the scars that the Civil War left on Russia? I mean, the Bolsheviks won, but they were presumably changed by the Civil War. I mean, they were ruthless from the start, but can you see them evolving through the Civil War into what they later became? And what are the long lingering effects of the Civil War on the Soviet Union and Russia? We've talked a little bit about the use of terror, but what are some of the other things you see?
I think that obviously the Civil War created a sort of a folk memory of fear, which was fundamental. We see this, I think, at the Stalin's funeral. People were afraid. What happens when the big man dies? When the strong man dies? Will there be another civil war? And even people who had suffered under Stalin in the Gulag, or had suffered from the NKVD and various secret police, even they were sort of appalled and probably were in tears too. But that was tears of fear of what might happen. And again, that apparently did come up again at the time of the fall of Gorbachev. People thinking, and Putin, I think, has sort of played the memory of the Civil War quite cleverly in a way. He has actually been much more of a supporter of the whites, interestingly, not of the reds, and some of his sort of curious ideological views about the imposition of Russian orthodoxy across the whole Eurasian landmass comes very much from white ideologues after the Civil War in exile, and it doesn't come at all from the Soviet side. But I think the interesting bit also is the way that when you say to what degree did things change. I mean, the great myth, of course, of the Soviet Union was the genius of Lenin, that Lenin was such a good, kind person. And none of this was seriously challenged, really, partly because there would have been no material from archives or anything like that which had emerged to contradict this particular notion and image until General Volker-Gonoff's book, and when he was the very first allowed into the Presidium archives and showed that actually, Lenin was the one who laid the groundwork for the Gulag, the Cheka, the secret police, for all of the horrors which have always really been attributed to Stalin. So I'm not trying to in any way to exonerate Stalin, but I think that what we've certainly seen over the last sort of 30, 40 years, at any rate, is the way that Lenin was the real founder of the Soviet Union with all of its horrors, and it wasn't just a question of Stalin being an aberration.
Now, I remember, probably from the Volker-Gonoff book, that order that Lenin gave when there was trouble in a district, and he gave orders just pick up any number of citizens, doesn't matter who, and hang them.
Yes.
As an example to the other, and I find it fascinating that you say Putin talks more about the whites, which I find very interesting. But he himself, of course, is a product of the secret police.
I know. But again, one of those curious political contradictions, I think, in that particular way. But there's no doubt about it. I mean, whether it's the palace on the Black Sea with all the gold double-headed eagles, and in the Kremlin, where there is virtually, I don't think there is any Soviet sort of symbols left. It's all Tsarist.
There's talk now, Antony, of a second Cold War. Do you think that's premature? Do you think that's a false analogy? And if there is a second Cold War, is it like the first Cold War between the Soviet Union and its allies and the United States and its allies, or is there something different about what's happening now?
I think there is something different. I mean, Cold War I, as one might refer to it, going up until really 1989, was, shall we say, predictable in certain ways. It was at least predictable in that communist leaders, whether China or Russia, usually kept to their word if they made an agreement. What is very worrying about Cold War II, if one can use that phrase now, is what is basically the future of diplomacy. If you cannot in any way rely upon an agreement, and let's face it, Putin will change his mind in no time at all, will contradict himself, will not stick to anything that he has ever promised. How on earth do you negotiate with somebody like that? And we've been seeing a similar thing, really, with China, with President Xi, the promises that they would never fortify the atolls in the South China Sea or anything like that. Well, of course, that was immediately ignored, and they did that, and we've seen the wolf diplomacy and so forth. So from that point of view, we are in a different world. It is a different sort of, the future of geopolitics is rather different. We are seeing, though, a change from the old sort of left-right balance, which goes all the way back to the Russian Civil War, the split of fascism, communism, etc., which carried all the way through. But now, in fact, what we're of course seeing is actually a change of axis towards authoritarianism or democracy as the sort of two opposite poles. Now, we, again, we're seeing also a coalition forming on both sides, whether it's countries like sort of, Cuba and Venezuela supporting, and now Iran, supporting, say, Russia and China, against what they see as the West. So it's a continuation, in a way, of Cold War II. It's a continuation of Cold War I. Where it's going to lead, of course, is impossible to say. And this is where Putin's decisions, which he is probably going to be taking fairly soon as the military situation deteriorates, whether to use the nuclear weapons or not, is going to become absolutely vital. I don't think he will use nuclear weapons. I think it's far more dangerous that he will actually use chemical weapons. But above all, the appointment of General Surovikin and the destruction of towns and infrastructure is an act of vengeance, bitterness and revenge, knowing that they cannot win this particular war against Ukraine. So how that one will play out, I don't know. But I do know that one thing, and that is that I think Crimea is going to be absolutely key to the whole process. It seems now that the Americans, and therefore the British, are no longer opposing the idea of Ukraine actually attacking Crimea, which was sort of unthinkable just a few weeks ago. So whether that will be seen as the existential threat that Putin has been warning about. But for most Russians, it must be said, Crimea is Potemkin, Catherine the Great, and Sevastopol, and something which they would find, even those who oppose Putin within Russia, would find almost totally unacceptable. So I think that's going to be one interesting area to see, but it's very, very hard, obviously, to predict how long this war is going to go on for, and what the final outcome will be.
I think what Ukraine has done is made us aware, as you've done in your book on the Civil War, about the long lines that can lead from the past up to the present and the way in which the past keeps shadowing the present. Yeah. But in Ukraine, it seems to me that we have almost two different things going on. One is sort of Russian imperialism, yet again, but because of the meaning of Ukraine and because of outside involvement, it is also a stage in confrontation between two systems or two organizations of states with different values. It seems to me almost overlapping. Two issues are at stake here.
No, I agree entirely. I mean, in fact, it's probably even more complicated than that, with Putin needing also to keep an eye over his shoulder to what degree both China and India will do, or how they will react, because as far as China is concerned, the idea of the use of a battlefield nuclear weapon or anything like that, I think it's very scary, because with their own plans for Taiwan and so forth, the last thing they want is any justification for the Americans to start providing Taiwan with nuclear warheads to defend themselves. So I can see, shall we say, a lot of clashing priorities and interests here. Yeah.
But in the long run, I think what this war has done is leave a greatly weakened Russia. I mean, the belief that I had, perhaps you never did, that the Russian military was superior, that they had been modernizing and they were capable of fighting major wars, and they've been held off by a much smaller force, and they've also left a Russia much more dependent on China.
Absolutely. In fact, Putin has achieved the opposite of everything that he set out to do. I mean, it's quite astonishing in that particular way. But it does say, as you point out, it does demonstrate very much the way we overestimated Russian fighting power in the past. And, I think back to my days in the Cold War on the sort of, the whole idea, dare the North German plain, and how long we'd have been able to hold them back and all the rest of it. I think we might have been able to hold them back without having to withdraw until the nuclear decision was taken, which was the strategy of the First Cold War. Yeah. So that's certainly sort of, one aspect in that particular way. But it wasn't just a question of overestimating. What has also changed between the First Cold War and the Second, of course, is the degree of corruption, and especially in the armed forces. Yeah. Ever since Putin decided to start throwing money at them after the disasters in Georgia, the invasion of Georgia and all the rest of it, there's no doubt about it, the way that the sort of the generals managed to milk the system, above all the whole of the procurement system. And as a result, the idea of, and sort of, to have prestige projects like the Armata tank, which was only capable, really, of trundling across Red Square on the 9th of May, rather than being an effective battlefield weapon, has shown, shall we say, an astonishing lack of foresight in the way that they were, shall we say, preparing for their next war.
So we may be seeing, who knows, we're running short of time now, we may be seeing another regime in Russia which has reached the end of its capacities. We may be seeing another crumbling of another regime in Russia over a century after the end of the Tsarist regime. And that was not followed by a very happy period at all. I just want to remind people about Antony's extraordinary book. I don't know if you can see the cover here, about Russia and the Civil War. It is enormously depressing, but it is something that I think is increasingly important. I mean this as a compliment, because you're dealing with a very depressing subject, but it is a book that is increasingly important to read at the moment. It shows the long shadow that the past can have. Antony, thank you for this conversation. It's been a great privilege. And I'd like to thank the Charleston Literary Festival in South Carolina for allowing us to take part. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elle.